That morning, I put on my old suit, the same one I wore to my wife's funeral, and walked into the law office where my son's inheritance was about to be decided. The first eyes I met weren't welcoming. They were Darlene's, my daughter-in-law. She looked at me like the house, the land, even my own name already belonged to her. My son sat beside her, silent. In that silence, my heart broke. I raised that boy alone after his mother passed, and now he wouldn't even defend me. But what they didn't know was that in my pocket, I carried something that could shatter every lie they'd spun against me. When I placed that small USB drive on the table, Darlene's smile faltered for the first time. Stay with me until the end of my story. And comment the city you're watching from. I want to know how far my voice can reach. Morning light filtered through the blinds, soft and pale, casting long shadows across the quiet kitchen. The silence in the house pressed down harder than the creak of the floorboards or the ticking clock on the wall. Ever since her passing, every corner of this place carried her absence. The scent of her morning coffee no longer lingered. The gentle sound of her slippers shuffling across the tile never came. The stillness left behind was the kind that settled deep into the bones. The calendar on the wall stared back, a red circle marking today's date. It wasn't just another day, it was the day of the inheritance meeting. My son Lloyd, my daughter-in-law Darlene, and the lawyers would all be waiting. The house we built, the savings tucked away, even the land that had been in the family for generations, all of it hung in the balance. I spooned oatmeal into a bowl, but it tasted like cardboard. Appetite had abandoned me weeks ago, replaced by a knot that never loosened. The meeting loomed larger than food, larger than the ache in the joints or the hollowness in my chest. It wasn't just about money. It was about whether the years of sacrifice, the sweat, and the sleepless nights for my family would be respected or erased. After pushing the half-empty bowl aside, I straightened my jacket, tugged at the sleeves, and picked up the worn leather folder I had carried to meetings for decades. Inside, notes, documents, reminders, my attempt to stay one step ahead. At 72, memory sometimes slipped, but dignity was a fight I wasn't ready to lose. The driveway outside glistened from a thin veil of dew. My shoes tapped softly against the stone walkway as I headed toward the garage. For a moment, I let myself breathe in the mountain air of Asheville. Crisp, cool, touched with pine. The kind of air my wife loved. The reason we stayed here even when others urged us to move closer to the city. At the edge of the driveway, a man stood leaning against a sleek black sedan. He straightened as soon as he saw me, his eyes shifting uneasily. He was Darlene's driver, the one she used for errands when she wanted to show the world she had arrived. The sight of him there, so early, stirred a ripple of unease. "Morning, sir," he said, his voice tight. He hesitated, glancing back at the garage door before continuing. "You may want to double-check before driving today." The words hung heavy, sharper than the chill in the air. His gaze dropped quickly, as if he'd already said too much. I paused, my grip tightening on the folder in my hand. "What do you mean?" I asked, but he only shook his head, muttered something about being late, and slid into the sedan. Moments later, the car disappeared down the road, leaving me with more questions than answers. My pulse ticked faster as I opened the garage door. The familiar smell of oil and dust greeted me, but something else too, a faint, acrid hint of gasoline. I frowned and stepped closer to the car, the old Buick that had carried me faithfully for years. Settling into the driver's seat, I turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then fell silent. Once, twice. Same result, sliding out. I lifted the hood. Loose wires dangled where they shouldn't, and the smell of fuel grew sharper. A memory surfaced, Darlene's sharp voice during last week's argument about the house. "You're old, Gerald. Let Lloyd handle things before you make a mistake you can't fix." It wasn't just the car that had been tampered with. This was a message. I wiped my hands on a rag, staring at the silent engine. For a long moment, the thought of calling Lloyd or even Darlene crossed my mind, but the image of her smug smile, Her habit of twisting words stopped me cold. Silence was safer. Better to watch, to measure, than to hand them another chance to call me paranoid or senile. In that quiet garage, I understood something deeper. Today wasn't about the documents waiting at the lawyer's office. It was about me, whether I still had the strength to stand, to speak, to claim the years of sacrifice as mine. The car wasn't going anywhere, but I was. With a steady breath, I locked the garage and turned toward the street. A neighbor's car, a taxi, even a walk if it came to it, I would make it. Each step away from the Buick felt heavier, yet strangely freeing. This wasn't just a broken engine. It was the opening shot in a battle that would test more than my patience. It would test my dignity. The law office smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Marble floors stretched ahead, catching the light from tall windows that looked out onto downtown Asheville. Every step echoed more than it should have, as if the building itself wanted to remind me how small one man could feel. Her eyes found me first. Darlene sat upright in the waiting area, back straight, chin tilted just enough to say she owned the place. That look, cool, sharp, stripped of respect, wasn't the gaze of a daughter-in-law greeting her husband's father. It was a glance of possession, as if she had already claimed what wasn't yet hers. Inside the conference room, polished wood gleamed under recessed lights. My son was there already. Lloyd sat to one side of the table, shoulders hunched in his suit, eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. He didn't look up, not once. The air was thick with Morton Hale's formality, his clipped voice reciting procedures that sounded like sentences. Darlene leaned back slightly, lips pressed in that self-satisfied line she wore when she believed she was winning. The order of the family had shifted. I, once the head, had been invited here like a guest. They didn't have to speak to cut me down. Darlene leaned toward Lloyd, whispering something I couldn't hear, her hand brushing his sleeve with practiced ease. When she glanced at me again, it carried faint disdain, the kind that pricks deeper than shouting. My chest tightened with memories of late nights, of balancing bills, of working longer hours so Lloyd could have the education that opened doors for him. Those sacrifices were carved into my bones. Yet here, my son wouldn't meet my eyes. Morton cleared his throat, shifting the meeting forward. "Concerns have been raised about your health, Mr. Rhines," he said smoothly, as though reading a line from a script. The words hung in the air, sharp, meant to cut. "Your memory, your judgment. There may be questions about your ability to manage the estate." Darlene's eyes sharpened like the edge of a knife. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. That stare was louder than any accusation. My fists curled beneath the table, nails pressing into skin, but I held my tongue. Silence had its own power, and I would not hand them the satisfaction of seeing me stumble. Then came the deepest wound. Lloyd said nothing, no denial, no defense, not even the courtesy of a glance my way. That silence carried more weight than Morton's words or Darlene's stare. Silence told me I was already being written out, as though my story no longer belonged in the legacy I had built. The chill in that room wasn't from the air conditioning. It was the cold truth of betrayal sitting across the table, whispering in the ear of the boy I once carried on my shoulders. That silence told me more than any accusation, that I was already being written out of my own legacy. The folder slid across the polished wood table with a sound that cut sharper than words. Fingers hesitated before opening it, as though they already knew the venom it carried. Inside, the pages stared back with neat medical reports, stamped and signed. Lines jumped out. Memory lapses. Episodes of confusion. Early signs of dementia. A rush of disbelief surged. Those weren't the words of Dr. Kendall, the man who had checked vitals not 2 months ago and told there was strength enough to see another decade. These reports belonged to someone else. Someone with an agenda. Looking up. Morton Hale's eyes revealed nothing. Cool and professional. As though he were reading grocery lists instead of dismantling a man's life. Across the table, Darlene sat perfectly still, lips pressed in something that almost resembled pity. but wasn't. Her eyes glimmered like she'd been waiting for this moment. The air in the office pressed heavy. Memories from the last visit with Dr. Kendall floated back, so clear they might have happened yesterday. The firm handshake, the chuckle about blood pressure being better than most men 20 years younger. Yet here, on these pages, were lies so carefully crafted they almost looked real. Forgetting birthdays, losing track of appointments, wandering in neighborhoods at night. None of it had ever happened. A glance at Lloyd, seated stiffly in his chair, revealed his gaze fixed on the floor. Not once did he meet the eyes that had watched over him since childhood. Silence stretched across the room like a verdict. Morton reached for another document, sliding it forward with deliberate care. A single sheet this time, but heavier than the rest. At the bottom, there was a signature. It was supposed to be mine. The letters curved like mine, but too carefully, like someone studying rather than living the hand. The strokes trembled in places that my hand never did. Power of attorney. Complete authority shifted away, as though life itself had been signed over. Eyes lifted to Lloyd again, hoping for a flicker of outrage, for him to push the paper back and say, "This isn't real." He remained still, hands folded, jaw clenched, but voice absent. Darlene leaned in closer to him, her shoulder brushing his. Her silence was a command, and he obeyed it. Words rose in the throat, but Morton raised a hand smoothly, cutting off any protest. "Mr. Rhines," he said, voice steady as polished stone, "this is all in the best interest of the family. Legal safeguards. Protection against unfortunate decline." The word decline landed with the weight of a coffin lid. Darlene's faint smile widened just enough to show she was savoring the moment. She wanted a reaction, an explosion, a breakdown she could point to and say, "See, he's unstable." Instead, the jaw tightened. Hands folded on the lap. Silence became the shield. Let them think victory was easy. Every detail was being stored. The twitch in Darlene's left brow, the faint ink smudge near Morton's thumb, the hesitation in Lloyd's breathing. The room seemed to shrink, its walls closing in. These weren't just papers. They were weapons, sharpened to cut away everything that made a man who he was. Not just the property, not just the accounts, but the very right to decide when to breathe, when to speak, when to leave the house. The realization struck with chilling clarity. This battle was no longer about money. It was about erasure. They were rewriting the story of a life, one forged signature at a time. Leaning back in the chair, every muscle fought to remain steady. They weren't just taking my property. The thought formed like iron. They were taking my very right to exist as myself. The sting of those forged papers still clung to my chest, a dull ache that no silence could mask. I steadied my breathing, forcing myself not to break, not to let them see me unravel. The room reeked of polished wood and manipulation, and Morton Hale's smug expression told me they thought they had already buried me. Then the door opened. A man I barely recognized stepped inside carrying a worn briefcase. He wasn't dressed in the sharp arrogance of lawyers, but his presence cut through the tension like a draft of cold air. Harvey Loden. They called him. I remembered seeing him once in passing, but never in a room that mattered. Today, he looked as though he mattered a great deal. Morton's jaw tightened, his lips twitching into a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Darlene straightened in her chair. A flicker of surprise she failed to hide. Control had been hers, until this moment. Harvey introduced himself calmly, placing the briefcase on the polished table. "I've been asked to review certain discrepancies in these documents." His voice carried authority without the showmanship of Morton's. There was no grand gesture, just precision, the kind that draws attention by not seeking it. I sat still, studying him, wary, yet sensing a rare thing in this room, integrity. My son's wife shifted beside him, eyes narrowing, lips pressing tight. She darted a glance toward Lloyd, a silent command for him to hold steady, to follow her lead. But Harvey wasn't following anyone's lead. He spread the so-called medical reports before us. His fingers tapped gently against the header. "This," he said, "comes from a hospital software system that hasn't been in use since 2015. His words fell heavy, undeniable, My pulse quickened, memories of my actual doctor's visits flashing in my mind, clean bills of health, nothing like the accusations of decline written in these lies. Morton shifted in his chair, brushing the words away with a dismissive chuckle. Clerical errors, nothing more. These things happen. But Harvey didn't flinch. Clerical errors don't invent software that doesn't exist anymore, and they don't misdate multiple forms in exactly the same way. I caught the faint tremor in Darlene's hand as she reached for her water glass. Lloyd sat stiff, shoulders tense, avoiding my eyes as always. My son, the boy I had raised alone, the man I thought would carry on our name, looked smaller by the second. Harvey leaned in slightly, his tone still calm but sharper now. If necessary, I can authenticate the document's metadata from this very office printer. That would tell us exactly when and where these pages were produced. The words hung in the air like a noose. Darlene's smile cracked for the first time, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the table. Lloyd swallowed hard, his silence now a kind of confession. I didn't speak. For once. My silence was not surrender, it was strategy. Let them twist. Let them reveal themselves while I observed. Every glance, every twitch of a hand was evidence. Morton's composure finally cracked. He snapped his folder shut and stood abruptly. That's enough for today. We'll reconvene tomorrow. His voice strained with control he no longer had. I rose slowly, deliberately, every movement a statement that I was still standing. They had wanted to erase me quietly, to bury me under forged words and false papers, but now, the cracks in their perfect facade had begun to show. As I walked out of that office, the weight in my chest shifted. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, the tide had turned. They wanted me erased quietly, but now, the cracks had begun to show. The drive back home after that aborted meeting felt longer than usual, though the streets of Asheville were quiet. My hands still trembled slightly on the wheel of the borrowed car, but it wasn't fear, it was the weight of what I had just seen. Harvey's appearance had bought me a breath of air, but in my gut I knew Darlene wouldn't let it end there. She never did. Pulling into the driveway, the house looked just as I had left it, the porch light casting a steady glow, the old maple tree shadowing the yard. Yet something inside tugged at me, a ripple of unease, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural, like the pause before a storm. Stepping into the front hall, the breath caught in my throat. The living room looked like a hurricane had torn through it. Drawers yanked out, cushions slashed open, photo frames smashed into shards across the floor. But it wasn't random, not at all. My eyes went straight to the coffee table, where the framed photo of my wedding day once sat. The glass was shattered, the picture missing. The bookshelves were toppled, but only the shelves with family albums. My late wife's keepsakes lay scattered on the rug, her favorite porcelain angel figurine broken clean in half. This wasn't burglary. My watch collection sat untouched in its case. The silver set from my parents gleamed where it always had. No one had come here for money. They'd come for me, kneeling down. I picked up the torn corner of a family photo, the one of Lloyd at his college graduation. The rip ran right through my face, as if someone had deliberately wanted to erase me. A whisper slipped past my lips before I even knew I'd spoken. This is Darlene's work. She wants the world to think I've lost control. Anger surged, sharp and hot, but beneath it was something colder, the ache of humiliation. It wasn't just the destruction, it was the message. They weren't stealing things. They were stealing memories, tearing apart symbols of the life I'd built, to make it look as though I had done it myself. The knock at the door startled me. I stood slowly, heart pounding. When I opened it, there stood Mrs. Klein from next door, her thin frame framed by the porch light. She clutched her cardigan tightly, her eyes flicking past me into the wreckage. I got a call earlier," she stammered. "Darlene said she was worried about you. Said you might, get overwhelmed. I just wanted to check in." Her words stung worse than the broken glass at my feet. She wasn't accusing, not directly, but the doubt was there, plain in her eyes. Doubt planted carefully by someone who knew exactly how to play the part of a caring daughter-in-law. I forced a steady voice. "Thank you. Mrs. Klein, I'm fine. Just a little mess to sort out." She hesitated, then gave me a faint, nervous smile and left. The silence she left behind pressed in heavier than before. I stood in that wrecked room, fists clenched, and felt the weight of choice. I could rage, call the police, storm over to confront Darlene, but that was exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to look unstable. No, not this time. Instead, I fetched my old digital camera from the study. Slowly, methodically. I documented everything. The broken angel figurine, the torn photographs, the untouched valuables, snap after snap. I captured the fingerprints of manipulation. I even took notes, time, date, what was missing and what was left, not just for myself, but for the day I would need to show someone else. Sitting down at the edge of the ruined couch, I allowed myself one long breath. If they wanted the world to see me as broken, I would show them instead how a broken man fights back, with proof. The morning air in Asheville was crisp, carrying that faint bite of fall that seeps into the bones. I straightened my old gray suit jacket, the one I had worn to church years ago with my late wife, and slipped the photographs deeper into my inner pocket. Each step toward Morton Hale's law office felt deliberate, as if the weight in my chest was marching along with me. When I entered the building, Alan Riker was already there. He looked up from his seat in the hallway, gave me a short nod, nothing flamboyant, just a subtle flicker that told me he was in my corner. Inside, Darlene was waiting. Her polished heels clicked against the floor as she adjusted herself in the chair, her lips curving into a smug smile that screamed confidence. She believed last night's scene had tipped the balance. Her eyes scanned me the way one inspects old furniture, meant to be discarded. Morton Hale cleared his throat as I took my seat. The long oak table stretched between us like a battlefield. "Mr. Rhines," he began, his tone dripping with legal courtesy, "we've had troubling reports. Your behavior has raised concerns. The incident at your home last night underscores the instability we've been documenting." I sat quietly, folding my hands together. Instability. That was the word they wanted to tattoo on my forehead, across from me. Lloyd sat rigid, not once lifting his gaze. My own son, a man I had carried through hardship, couldn't even meet my eyes. And Darlene, her smile widened like she had already sealed my fate. Let them revel in their confidence. I told myself. They didn't know what was sitting in my pocket. Morton droned on about family best interest, about protective measures. But I barely heard him. The cadence of his voice was just noise. What mattered was timing. Finally, when the words "unfit guardian" spilled out, I leaned forward and slipped the folder from my coat. The photographs landed on the table with a soft thud. Faces around me stiffened. There they were, my torn family photos, the shattered angel figurine that had belonged to my wife, the ransacked shelves, all carefully documented, but valuables, jewelry boxes, silverware, electronics, left untouched. "This wasn't a burglary," I said, each word measured, clear. This was theater. The silence that followed was heavy. Harvey Loden leaned in, adjusting his glasses, studying the pictures with keen interest. Morton coughed into his fist, as if buying time to assemble a response. Darlene's lips pressed tight, her fingers twitching against the armrest of her chair. Morton finally spoke, his voice sharp. "These photographs don't prove anything. Mr. Rhines, irrelevant. They don't change the concerns about your condition." I didn't flinch. Instead, I leaned back, letting the words hang in the room. Alan Riker broke the quiet. "Irrelevant?" His voice was calm but firm. "These photos speak directly to intent. If valuables weren't touched, what exactly was the purpose of this so-called break-in? Someone is manufacturing evidence against my client." The room shifted. Lloyd's head dropped, his shoulders sinking deeper into the chair. He couldn't look at me. Darlene shot him a glance sharp enough to draw blood, but he kept his eyes fixed on the table. Morton shuffled papers, his practiced confidence cracking at the edges. I gathered the photographs back into the folder, taking my time, every motion deliberate, like I was reclaiming something more than paper. When the folder was closed, I looked across the table, my eyes locking with Darlene's. "I will not be erased from my own story." The words came out steady, without anger, but they landed heavier than any outburst could have. For the first time since this all began, Darlene blinked, her confidence faltered, if only for a moment, but I knew better than to think it was over. That smile of hers would return, sharper than before, and her next move would strike closer to the heart. The house welcomed me with silence that night, though it didn't feel like the comfort of solitude. It felt hollow, stripped of warmth, as if the very walls had overheard the arguments of the day and chosen to withdraw from me. I dropped my coat on the chair by the door, knowing it didn't matter whether the place was tidy anymore. Darlene had already painted me as unstable. Still, a flicker of defiance stayed alive in my chest. Those photographs I'd shown today were a small victory, a reminder that I wasn't as helpless as they wanted me to be. Yet even as I held on to that thought, unease pressed harder. Darlene's face when the meeting adjourned haunted me. Not anger, not worry, but a smile. It was the smile of someone confident her next move was already in play. I sank into my armchair and let the quiet stretch until the phone shattered it. The ring startled me more than it should have. Caller ID, Lloyd. For a moment, warmth stirred. Maybe my son had seen through her. Maybe blood was stronger than manipulation. Maybe tonight, he would speak to me as a son again. "Dad," he began, but his tone carried none of the tenderness I remembered from when he was a boy. Instead, his words came flat, polished, rehearsed. "I've spoken to Darlene and Morton. You need to stop fighting this. You're embarrassing yourself." The floor seemed to tilt. Hope turned quickly to something bitter. "Embarrassing myself?" I repeated slowly. "Do you hear yourself, son? You watched them put forged papers in front of me today. Does that sound like justice to you?" He paused. But it wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. "You're confused," he said. The words clipped and distant, maybe too old to handle these decisions. I closed my eyes. There it was, Darlene's voice. Morton's words, crawling out of my son's mouth. He wasn't speaking to me, he was reciting. "Lloyd," I said softly, trying to reach through the fog they had built around him. "I raised you after your mother passed. I worked double shifts so you could go to college. Every dime I saved was for you. And now you stand by while she tells you I'm losing my mind. Look at me. Listen to me. Use your own judgment." Silence lingered on the line. For a heartbeat, I thought I'd broken through. Then his reply came, colder than the silence itself. "Not in this matter." The words were final. A verdict. And then the line went dead. I sat in the dark with the receiver heavy in my hand, my chest aching like someone had driven a stake straight through it. The quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of something breaking inside me. The phone buzzed again. A text. I glanced at the screen, from Darlene's number, but signed as if from Lloyd. "Next time, don't show up at our meetings." My hands trembled. Anger surged hot, but it collided with heartbreak so deep it left me shaking. They weren't just stripping away my rights anymore. They were taking my son from me, twisting him into a weapon. I stared at that message until the letters blurred. Rage wanted to roar out of me, but sorrow anchored it down. In that moment, I understood. This war had crossed beyond legal battles. It was personal now, and the battlefield was my own family. The morning light bled through the blinds, pale and sharp, waking me long before I was ready. Sleep had been broken, haunted by Lloyd's voice from the night before. Flat, detached, rehearsed. He had sounded more like a spokesman than my son. Rising from the chair where I dozed off, every joint stiffened as though carrying the weight of betrayal. I shuffled toward the front door, planning only to fetch the paper, but there it was, a plain envelope wedged beneath the frame. Anonymous, silent, waiting. The air caught in my chest. No return address, no handwriting, just a smudge from a shoe or maybe a hand. I bent slowly, fingers trembling as I lifted it. For a moment I thought about tossing it aside. At my age, envelopes carried bad news more often than good. But something about the timing, it felt like a whisper in the dark. Inside were papers, photocopies of documents, and a small USB drive. No letter, no explanation, just evidence, or perhaps bait. The weight of it in my palm sent a shiver through me. Someone out there knew what I was facing, and they wanted me to have this. Back at the kitchen table, I plugged the USB into the old laptop my wife had once used to send emails to the grandchildren. The screen flickered, and then a file opened. An audio recording filled the room. At first, just muffled tones. Then, clear as glass, Morton Hale's voice. And then, Darlene's. Once we prove him unfit, Lloyd signs everything. Her voice dripped with confidence, every syllable a blade. Morton replied smoothly, like a man reading from a script. The medical reports will stand. Confusion here, memory lapse there. We'll make the record fit the narrative. I froze. My own house seemed to lean in, walls absorbing every word. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. They had plotted it, carved the lines of my erasure long before I walked into that office. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, loud enough I feared it might drown out the recording. I played it again, then again. Each time, the sting grew sharper, the betrayal heavier. Darlene's arrogance painted every pause. Morton's clipped tones gave it structure, and behind their voices, the silence of my son echoed even louder. Who had sent this? Harvey Loden, the quiet witness who had already hinted at cracks in their story. Or Alan Riker, the young lawyer with eyes that seemed to say more than his mouth ever dared. Or maybe someone else entirely. Another shadow watching them, unwilling to let me be buried alive in lies. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, trying to let the anger settle into something sharper, something usable. Rage would not save me. Proof might. The papers in the envelope were copies of the so-called medical reports, but these versions carried notations, dates highlighted, margins marked with errors. Whoever prepared this wanted me to see the inconsistencies, to have more than just words against them. I placed everything carefully into my old leather briefcase. That briefcase had once carried mortgage contracts, bills of sale, the tools I used to build the life they now wanted to strip from me. The leather was cracked, its handle worn, but it felt strong in my hand. They think I'm too old to fight, I murmured, half to myself, half to the memory of my late wife. But patience has always been an old man's weapon, and patience gathers proof. For the first time in days, resolve settled heavier than fear. Downtown Asheville gleamed under the morning sun as I walked toward Morton Hale's office. The familiar streets felt changed, as though each step carried me closer to a battlefield rather than a meeting. My briefcase swung at my side, heavier than it had ever been. Inside the lobby, the polished wood floors reflected the light too brightly, making me squint. And there they were, Darlene and Lloyd, sitting side by side like royalty on display, smug in their certainty. Darlene's smile cut across the room, sharp as a knife. Lloyd wouldn't meet my eyes. I lowered myself into a chair, briefcase resting beside me. My fingers brushed its worn handle once more, grounding myself. They didn't know, I thought, watching them, letting my silence be the shield. The truth was already in my pocket. The boardroom felt colder than usual as I walked in, the briefcase heavy in my hand. I placed it carefully on the polished oak table, the sound echoing like a gavel. Darlene sat poised, eyes gleaming with certainty, while Morton adjusted his tie with that smug confidence of a man who thought he had already won. Lloyd, my son, he couldn't bring himself to meet my gaze. For a moment, I let the silence sit there, thick and suffocating. Then I spoke, steady and calm. Before you strip me of my dignity, hear this. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket and slid it across the table. Fingers slightly trembled as I opened my laptop, but my voice never wavered. With a click, the recording began. Morton's oily tone filled the room. If we make him look unfit, the case rights itself. And then, Darlene's sharper voice. Once we prove him incompetent, Lloyd signs everything. The words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, no one breathed. Morton's jaw slackened, his pen falling from his hand. Darlene froze mid-smile, her eyes darting toward Lloyd as if to gauge his reaction. And Lloyd, He finally looked at me. But it wasn't the look of a son defending his father. It was the look of a man who realized the ground beneath his feet had just cracked open. Morton was the first to recover, though his voice betrayed him with a stutter. This could be fabricated. Doctored recordings can sound convincing. His hands fumbled with his papers as though he could bury the truth under legal jargon. Alan Riker, calm as ever, leaned forward. Chain of custody is provable. Metadata won't lie, and if necessary, a forensic expert can confirm its authenticity. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority behind his words made the whole room shift. I saw Lloyd's shoulders sink ever so slightly, doubt beginning to creep into his posture. Darlene, however, wasn't one to fold easily. She sat straighter, lips pursed. Gerald, this is desperate. Who knows where you even got this? Her tone was venom wrapped in honey, but it didn't cover the crack in her facade. Before she could spin more lies, Harvey Loden stood. No one expected him to speak, least of all Darlene. I know where some of those documents came from, he said firmly. I saw your driver deliver files to Morton's office late at night, more than once. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Darlene snapped, her mask slipping at last. You don't know what you're talking about, she hissed, her composure unraveling. The polished woman who had orchestrated every move so carefully was finally showing the panic beneath. I stayed silent, simply watching. Inside, a quiet strength rose. The fortress they had built on lies was crumbling, and they knew it. Morton, red-faced, slammed his folder shut. This meeting is adjourned, he barked. His authority rang hollow now, like a cracked bell. Darlene pushed back her chair, nearly knocking it over. As she stormed past Lloyd, she bent low, whispering something sharp into his ear. I saw him flinch, torn between the woman at his side and the father across the table. I gathered my briefcase slowly, savoring the shift in the air. For the first time, I wasn't the one being silenced. As I walked toward the door, I thought to myself, the battle wasn't won yet, but the silence had finally been broken. The afternoon air outside the courthouse felt heavier than the wood-paneled boardroom I had just left. Reporters lingered on the courthouse steps, cameras clicking like restless insects. Darlene gripped Lloyd's arm as if she owned it, her lips moving quickly against his ear. I stood a few feet away, watching my son's eyes dart between her and me. For a moment, he looked like a boy again, caught between two parents, though he was no boy anymore. Alan Riker slipped beside me, lowering his voice. Morton won't stop here, he said. He'll push for another hearing, file motions, whatever it takes to keep you off balance. His words were calm, but I knew they carried the weight of truth. A camera flash lit my face, and I felt exposed, yet strangely unburdened. Secrets had been dragged into the light. Let the world see. I had lived long enough to know shadows only grow when left alone. The drive home was quiet. My old sedan hummed steadily, its worn leather seat reminding me of simpler days. When I stepped inside the house, the silence pressed down hard. The walls carried echoes of my wife's laughter, the soft hum of evenings when Lloyd was still small. Now they only gave me questions. Where had I gone wrong? Had sacrifice become invisible once the years piled up? A knock at the door pulled me out of the spiral. Harvey Loden stood there, briefcase in hand. He entered without ceremony, placing a set of printed emails on my kitchen table. I kept copies, he said, his tone steady. Morton and Darlene thought the firm's servers were scrubbed, but metadata doesn't lie. My hands hovered over the pages, eyes catching words that painted their betrayal in black and white. I wanted to thank him with a firm handshake, but what came out was quieter. You've given me back more than evidence. You've given me a chance to stand tall. Harvey nodded once, then left as unceremoniously as he arrived, the door closing behind him like a seal over new resolve. Alone again. I placed the documents in my desk drawer, next to the photographs from the staged break-in. My breath slowed, and the words slipped out before I knew I had spoken them. This isn't over. Tomorrow, I fight back. For the first time in years, a steady fire coursed through my chest, not the fire of anger alone, but of a man who still had something left to defend. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long stripes across the worn hardwood floor of my living room. The house was still, the kind of stillness that carried weight. My body felt heavy from nights of sleeplessness. But inside, a fire had begun to kindle again. The words I whispered to myself carried more force than I expected. If I was going to lose my son, it wouldn't be without him hearing my truth first. Alan's call came early. His voice was steady but urgent, suggesting that I meet Lloyd face to face before matters spiraled into a courtroom circus. He'd arranged a neutral spot, a small cafe downtown, quiet enough for conversation but public enough to prevent theatrics. "This is your chance," Alan said, "but it has to be now." I agreed without hesitation. By mid-morning, I was there. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and buttered toast, simple and grounding. When the door opened, Lloyd walked in, and right behind him, Darlene. Of course she came. The puppeteer never lets go of the strings. She clutched his arm as if guiding him, though anyone with eyes could see it was control disguised as care. Lloyd's eyes met mine only briefly before sliding away. He looked conflicted, his shoulders tense, his jaw set as though bracing for a blow. I felt a rush of grief and pride all at once. Grief for the distance between us, pride for the man he'd once been, the boy I had raised alone after his mother passed. We sat, for a moment. Only the clinking of cups around us filled the silence. I leaned forward, speaking not as an accuser, but as a father who had carried too much for too long. I told him about the nights I stayed up after his mother's death, about patching shoes, cooking simple meals, finding ways to pay for school when money ran thin. Every word was a thread I tried to weave back into the bond that Darlene had worked so hard to cut. Darlene's interruption came sharp as a knife. "This isn't about bedtime stories, Gerald," she sneered softly. "This is about control. You can't stand the idea that someone else might manage things better than you." I didn't raise my voice. My reply was steady, deliberate. "I don't want control. I want dignity, and I want my son back." The words surprised even me with their simplicity. It wasn't wealth I was fighting for. It was recognition, respect, the truth that my sacrifices weren't in vain. Lloyd's hands tightened on his coffee cup. His lips parted as if he might say something, but then Darlene leaned in close, whispering venom into his ear. "Think of our family's image. Think of what people will say if you let this drag on." Her threats weren't for me, they were for him, binding him tighter with fear of scandal. But I saw the crack. His eyes watered. His jaw trembled. For the first time in weeks, he looked less like a man certain of his choice, and more like the boy who used to run into my arms after scraping his knee, seeking comfort instead of judgment. The cafe around us blurred. All I could see was my son, caught in a tug of war between blood and manipulation. My heart ached, but my resolve hardened. I wouldn't let this moment pass without drawing the line. I rose from my chair slowly, the wood creaking beneath me, my hand pressed flat against the table, grounding myself as I looked at him, just him, not Darlene, not the lawyers, not the schemes. My voice came out steady, low, but it carried the weight of decades. "This ends now," I said. "Either you hear me as your father, or you lose me forever." The silence that followed was thick, heavier than any verdict I had ever faced in my life. The cafe had gone silent after my last words. The clatter of dishes from the counter seemed miles away. Lloyd sat across from me, shoulders tight, his hands clenched as though they were bound by invisible rope. Darlene leaned close, her voice sharp, pushing into the space between us. "You don't have to listen to this," she hissed at him. "He's just trying to drag you down with him. You're better than this." For a moment, I thought he would stay quiet, as he had so many times before. But then, his eyes lifted to mine, trembling with something I hadn't seen in years, honesty. His lips parted. "Dad," his voice broke. "I can't let her speak for me anymore." The chair screeched as Darlene stood up. "Weak," she spat. "You're throwing everything away for pity." But Lloyd shook his head. "No, Darlene, I'm throwing away your chains." At that moment, the boy I raised, the one I used to carry on my shoulders after his mother died, stepped out of the woman's shadow. That afternoon, we walked together into the courthouse. Alan Riker led us, calm but determined, while Harvey followed with a folder tucked under his arm. Darlene stormed ahead of us, her heels striking the marble like gunshots, whispering into Morton Hale's ear. Inside the hearing room, Morton cleared his throat and tried to regain control. His voice was firm but too polished, the way a man speaks when he knows his footing is slipping. He denied. He evaded. But Alan opened Harvey's folder, laying out emails, late-night exchanges between Morton and Darlene. Their words were unmistakable, strategies to paint me as unfit, discussions about fabricated medical notes, even timelines for when to spring the accusations. The judge's gavel cracked through the tension. "Mr. Hale, these emails contradict your testimony. An investigation will be launched immediately." Morton's face drained of color. For the first time, his words failed him. Justice isn't swift, but when it comes, it weighs heavy. By the time we stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the world had already caught wind. Reporters crowded around, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Rhines, do you feel vindicated? Is it true your daughter-in-law staged evidence against you?" I said nothing. The flashbulbs said enough. Darlene shoved past them, her hand clamped on Lloyd's arm like a vice, but this time he pulled away. The sound of it, her gasp, his quiet refusal, was louder than the crowd. She screamed at him, venom masked as concern, but the reporters recorded every word. By nightfall, headlines would not call her a devoted wife. They would call her what she was. And through it all, my son stood near me, silent, but near. I didn't win back fortune. I won back truth. And perhaps, just perhaps, I had started to win back my son. That evening, I sat in my wife's old chair, the one by the window where she used to read. Sunlight streamed across the floor, softer than it had in months. The house was still quiet, still empty, but no longer hollow. I held no illusions. Scars would remain. Lloyd and I had a long road ahead, if there was a road at all. But dignity, my dignity, was mine again. The world had tried to silence me. They tried to erase me from my own life, to turn me into a footnote in the story I had written with my sweat and sacrifice. But I spoke. And in speaking, I found justice, not only for myself, but for every father cast aside by the children they once carried. Every man told his years made him less than whole. The war was over. The lesson would remain.